Welcome to the mysteries of VLOOKUP function revealed. Yes, 14 amazing examples to help you to become a VLOOKUP master. And if you want to follow along with the examples in the video, you can download this Excel file in the link below the video. If you like what you see in this video, click that subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified about new videos. Here's the 14 examples. We're going to go from the basics to advanced. And this list of 14 VLOOKUP examples, this comes from over 2 decades of answering questions about VLOOKUP. And in this video, I try to put it all together into 14 topics that'll make you a VLOOKUP master. Now, this will be a long video with lots of topics, so guess what? Below the video, there's a time hyperlink table of contents. You can click on any time, and it will jump automatically to that part of the video. Now, we're going to start it off with the basics, talk about why VLOOKUP is everywhere, and then look at the difference between exact match lookup and approximate match lookup. Then we'll go on to more advanced topics. We're going to start it off by going to Sheet 1. Now, what do I mean by VLOOKUP is everywhere? Well, looking things up in lookup tables is a common task in business accounting and many other professions. And almost all lookup tables are vertical. Notice V is the first letter. They could have just called it lookup. And in fact, there is a straight lookup function. That was the original function all the way back in VisiCalc back in 1980. But soon after, because most tables were vertical, in came the VLOOKUP function. So VLOOKUP and vertical lookup tables are everywhere. Let's look at some examples, and we'll see that they are incredibly common. If I asked you what is the price for the quad product, well, if you knew that this was the lookup value and we had a lookup table, you take the lookup value, and in the first vertical column, you try to find a match. Once you find a match, you know this is the correct row, and there it is. 43.95 is what we're trying to return to whatever formula we're creating. As a second example, if your sales are 36,500, what is the commission bonus percentage that you earned? Well, this is the lookup value, and we find the correct category, $30,000 or more, all the way up to, but not including 40,000. That value fits in this category, so 4% is the value that we are going to return. Next example, human resources. If I ask you what Chuck's Hal's zip code is, well, you'd find a match in the first column. You know this is the correct row, and we would return the zip code 98111. Here's another lookup situation. If your income is $3,000, what is your tax? Here's the correct category for $3,000 lookup value, so the tax is 60 bucks. How about this one? What region does Miles Josephina represent? This is a typical lookup situation. We have a lookup value. We find a match in the first column. We know the correct row, so we return Southwest. How about your sales are $6,000. What's the earned commission? Well, here's the correct row. There's the returned value, $200. And as a final example, what if your sales are $375? What is the correct sales category? Well, this is the correct row for the lookup value 375, and that's the category, average. Not below par or excellent, just average. Now, you might be asking, if you're learning VLOOKUP for the first time, I'm going to use Control-Home to jump back to cell A1. There seems to be 2 different types of lookup. And in fact, there are. And the amazing thing about the VLOOKUP function is we can do exact match or approximate match. Now, what is exact match? That's when we have a lookup value and we're trying to find exactly the characters, QUAD. We have to find a match with only those 4 characters. That's called exact match. Down here, if we searched for 36,500 exactly, there is no exact match. But luckily, if we tell VLOOKUP this is the lookup value, but we want to do approximate match lookup, VLOOKUP will race through until it finds the first bigger number, and then it will know to jump back, and that's the right category. So every single time we do VLOOKUP, we have to ask, are we doing exact match or are we doing approximate match? All right, we want to go over to Sheet 2 and look at our first example. In this cell, we need to look up the price for the quad boomerang in this lookup table. That means we're trying to match exactly that in the first vertical column. That means we're going to do exact match lookup. Now, for both example 2 and 3, I actually have a bunch of notes in the yellow cells up here that describe the exact and approximate match. So you can look at that later. Now, here we go. We're going to do this formula. We're going to look up the price. Equal sign starts all formulas. And watch what happens when we type a V. A list of the possible functions that start with V pop up. When we type VL, we'll always get VLOOKUP. So if you're doing VLOOKUP a lot, it's equal sign VL and the tab key to accept the VLOOKUP from the blue highlighted option. So tab. Now there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different arguments we have to put into VLOOKUP. Now these arguments work just like we do it if we were looking something up manually. What does lookup value mean? Well, just like we have to look up quad and remember it to try and match it in the first column, so does VLOOKUP. So for lookup value, I put the item we're trying to look up and match. Now notice something about this screen tip. It tells us this is the VLOOKUP function, and then it tells us each one of the arguments it needs. Now we just put in lookup value. It's bold there. That's VLOOKUP saying that's what I need. Once you enter that argument, you have to type a comma. So when I type a comma, now the next argument is bold. Now this argument is called table array. This is where we highlight the entire lookup table. Now I always remember that the lookup table goes here because it has the word table. So I simply click to highlight the table. Now when you're putting a table array in for the VLOOKUP function, you do not highlight the field names, just the first vertical column with the items we're trying to match, and then any subsequent columns that have things you want to go and get and bring back to the cell. All right, so we have our table. We type a comma. Column index number is the next argument. Now, we know as humans looking this up manually to just read the word price, and we know that we have to get the price from this column. But VLOOKUP needs the column index number. And what that means is you have to count on your fingers. 1, 2, 3. This is the third column in this lookup table. Because it has the item we want to go and get and bring back to the cell, we simply type a 3 here. Now, if I type a 2, it would be getting supplier name. Backspace 3. When I type a 3, now VLOOKUP will know to get whatever's in the third column. In our case, price. Now we type a comma. Range lookup. Oh, here it is. This is our option, approximate match or exact match. This is where we tell VLOOKUP which of the two types of lookup to do. Now, we can simply arrow down. If we put true, it does approximate match. If we put false, VLOOKUP is instructed to do exact match. Now, that's what we want here. So watch this. I can simply hit Tab. Now, because false is in range lookup, VLOOKUP knows to do exact match. But now I'm going to delete this because there's something very important. There are other lookup functions. And in fact, later in this video, we will see the match function. And the match function has the same two options. But for approximate match, we have to put a 1. And for exact match, we have to put a 0. So what I do is instead of putting true and false, I put a 1 and 0. Then I know the universal code for approximate match or exact match. Now, by all means, you're welcome to put a false there. That's why that drop down is there. But for me, I'm putting a 0. 0 means false. 1 or true means approximate match. Now, in all of the notes, right down here and up there, it tells you you can put either or. All right, now watch this, close parentheses. And if I click back inside of the parentheses, the screen tip pops up. I can actually click on each part if I needed to edit it. But look at this. We have a lookup value. That's the item it's going to try and match in the first column. There's the lookup table. The column index, we're getting price from the third. And there's our exact match. So when I hit enter, that is so cool. That formula looked up quad and returned 43.95. Now if I type VRang and hit enter, that is magic. VLOOKUP totally looked this up, found a match, raced over to the third column, and went and got 18.95 and brought it back to the cell. Now think about that. For us using Excel and VLOOKUP, we want to have a firm idea in our brain of what VLOOKUP does. And what does it do? Yes, it looks something up and finds a match. But fundamentally, what does it do? It actually goes and gets something and brings it back to the cell. So now if I type Belen, enter, it did its job. It went and got something and brought it back to the cell. Now I'm going to try Carlota. And when I hit enter, NA, well, that is an error, but it's actually a polite error. That means not available. Anytime you get an NA when you're doing exact match, it means that thing is not in the first column. Now, click in the cell and hit F2. And now we see one of the most common errors with VLOOKUP, extra spaces. Remember what we said, exact match looks for all of the characters. And you better believe that when you hit the space bar, that is a character. It cannot find Carlota space. But when I backspace and hit enter, sure enough, now it's doing its job. It's going and getting the price for Carlota. Now, here's what you don't want to do. Oftentimes, people will learn the if function before they learn VLOOKUP. You don't ever want to do this. It takes too long to type the formula out, and it's totally inefficient. It'll give you the right answer, but it's just flat out too hard. All right, so we did exact match with a 0 in the fourth argument. Now let's go over to the sheet 3. Now on this sheet, our goal is to figure out the commission rate that Rod earned. Rod had sales of $17,382. Now, we're going to create the VLOOKUP formula here. This is our lookup table. What we don't want to do is F2. I definitely don't want to do that. It's so complicated. It's actually amazing how many people create formulas like this because they don't know the more simple VLOOKUP solution. So no problem. Here we're going to use VLOOKUP to look up the sales doing an approximate match lookup. Now I created this third column here so as we're learning VLOOKUP, we do not get confused with what that lower limit in the first column means. Now, for 2% to be earned, that means the salesperson had exactly 2,000 all the way up to, but not including the next lower limit. I listed it explicitly here. To earn 2%, you have to sell 20,000 or more all the way up to, but not including 30,000. So if we're going to do approximate match with this number on this table, we're actually not going to use this. We're only going to use these first two columns. Now notice, this first column is sorted smallest to biggest. Approximate match VLOOKUP will not work unless the first column is sorted smallest to biggest. Well, the good news is most tax tables, commission tables, tables for looking up sizes in construction, they always have a first column that's sorted smallest to biggest. Now, in rare cases, they'd have it from biggest to smallest, but then you have to do something besides VLOOKUP. But because most lookup tables are sorted smallest to biggest in the first column, they programmed VLOOKUP that way. Now, there's an easy way to remember how VLOOKUP takes a value and finds a match to determine the correct row. And here it is. Think of it this way. VLOOKUP will take that number and race through the first column until it finds the first number bigger, and then it knows to jump back to the previous row. Now, technically, that's not how it works. Technically, there's a computer process called a binary search that makes approximate match lookup really fast. But for us, we're always going to say, hey, there's the value. Race down the first column until it bumps into the first bigger one, and then jump back. Of course, thinking about it that way also helps us remember that if it's dependent on bumping into the first one bigger, that first column better be sorted smallest to biggest. All right, let's see how to do approximate match lookup. Equals VL tab lookup value. That's the thing VLOOKUP needs to look up and remember. Comma. The table, only the first two columns. Comma. Column index number. That call remembers that we need to give VLOOKUP the column number of the column that has the item I want to return. Since bonus commission is what I want to get and return, 1, 2, I simply type a 2. Now I type a comma. Here is where we put the option for approximate match. Now you can hit tab and put true. You can put a 1. But guess what? When they programmed VLOOKUP, since taxes and commissions and things like that are so common, they made this the default. So if you completely leave this argument out, VLOOKUP will know to do approximate match lookup. So watch this. Backspace. Do not accidentally leave a comma. Backspace. When you're doing approximate match lookup, don't even put that in. As soon as you put the column index, you simply close parentheses. So approximate match lookup is a little bit easier than exact match, except for, of course, you got to remember to sort this smallest to biggest. And would you like to do that one or this one? I'll take that one every day. Now let's do some testing to see how approximate match VLOOKUP works. Let's say our sales were really $37,000. When I hit enter, what did the VLOOKUP formula do? It took that number, raced through until it found the first one bigger, and jumped back. Then it went over to the second column, got that, and brought it back to the cell. What happens if Rod went crazy? $90,000 in sales. Well, what did VLOOKUP do? It took it, raced through, oh, and it never found one bigger. So it always will take the last one if it can't find anything bigger. So, of course, it returns 7.5%. Now, what if this was the worst day in Rod's sales history? Not only did he not have any sales, when they zeroed everything out, the credits outweighed the sales, so there was a negative number. Uh-oh, NA. And the reason why is when we're doing VLOOKUP approximate match, if the lookup value is less than the first possible number in the first column, it gives you an NA. That's why when you're designing this table, you have to put some number here that's smaller than any possibility. Now, sometimes when sales are possibly negative, they just put a really big negative number, like something like that. And this will take care of any negative numbers. I'm going to Control Z to undo because I'm going to leave it as 0. And then I'm going to Control Z to undo and bring it back to 90,000. All right, so that's approximate match lookup. Now we want to go talk about some really cool things that we can do to make VLOOKUP even better. I'm going to go over to the sheet 4, and we're going to go back to exact match. Now watch this. Once you get the hang of it, I need to look up the price for whatever product I put there. So equals VL tab, and guess what? Instead of taking my mouse and clicking, I'm going to use my arrow key to arrow over and get that lookup value, comma. And now we select the lookup table, comma. The column index is 3. That's the third column. Comma, 0 for exact match, close parentheses. And when I hit enter, NA, as soon as you see that, it means whatever's in that cell is not in this column. Now, it might mean that you didn't highlight the right table, right? But it still means that value is not in whatever the first column is. Now I'm going to Control Z. That undo actually undid my mistake. So what's going on here? Well, just as we saw earlier in the video, F2, there's that darn space. Well, we humans make mistakes all the time. I am going to backspace and hit Enter. That does fix it, but there's a much better way, something called data validation list. Well, if we're using VLOOKUP, and the lookup table is here, there's a great way to simply add a drop-down list that we can select from that will only select items from the first column. So you ready? I'm going to select the cell. Go up to the Data Ribbon tab. Now I'm in the latest version, so my icons may look a little bit different. But you want to find the Data Tools group and the Data Validation button. I'm simply going to click the Data Validation button. Data Validation. It's going to do exactly what the name means. Whatever data I put in there is going to be validated. Now there's a bunch of options. The default is any value, which means anytime you open up any spreadsheet, you can put anything you want in a cell. I'm going to click the drop down, and there's a bunch of cool options. You can limit it to whole numbers, decimals, date, time, text length, and all sorts of cool options. But the one we want is list. As soon as we select list, it says, what is your source? Now, for source, it has to be a one-way range, meaning either vertical or to the side. Now, for us, using VLOOKUP, it's always going to be vertical because, of course, the first column is vertical. Do not highlight the rest of the table, just the first column. From now on, there'll be an in-cell dropdown, and that cell will not allow anything unless it's already in the VLOOKUP table. So when I click OK, click in the cell, and now there's a drop down. That is true Excel magic. Data validation list with VLOOKUP. Now let's go look at our fifth example. I'm going to click on the sheet 5. Here we have a data set, and we imported this data set. This is a scientific experiment where we're tracking certain bats. These are the bat IDs. Here's the times of the sightings. And for our final report, we do not want bat ID. We actually want to look up for each row, looking up bat ID, and returning the full bat name. So no problem. VLOOKUP can do this. And this will be an exact match because we're trying to find exactly whatever these characters are in the first column. All right, so in C5 equals VL tab. Lookup value, I'm going to use my left arrow, comma. The table, I'm going to highlight the entire table, comma. Column index number, 1, 2, 3. And don't get confused with the letters up at the top. Sometimes when people are learning VLOOKUP, they might think because G is the 7th column, we should put a 7. But it's always from the point of view of the table. 1, 2, 3, we're trying to get something from the third column. So for column index, I type a 3, comma. 0, because we're doing exact match, close parentheses. Now, if I hit Enter, that will put the formula in the cell and push the cursor down. Well, if I want to copy that formula, I then have to select the cell again and then copy it. So instead of using Enter, I'm going to use Control-Enter. Control-Enter simply puts the thing in the cell and keeps the cell selected. Now, I want to copy this down. And that little green box in the lower right-hand corner is called the fill handle. And by the way, that cursor right there is called the selection cursor. But watch what happens when I move my selection cursor over that fill handle. Oh, it turns to a crosshair cursor, or I like to call it an angry rabbit cursor. Now, the cool thing about the angry rabbit cursor is you can click and drag and copy the formula down. Uh-oh, NAs. What in the world is going on? Well, anytime you copy a formula down a column, you always want to go to the last cell, and we're going to put it in edit mode using the F2 key. The reason that we go to the last cell and check it is because we want to verify that all the cell references are pointing in the correct location. Well, we can already see that the blue one is pointing in the correct location, but not the orange one. Why is the table down there? It should be up here. Well, that means we have to learn the difference between a relative cell reference and an absolute cell reference. Now, I'm going to go up to the top and hit the F2 key. Notice the blue one is looking one cell to my left. And as I copy the formula down, notice the blue cell reference is actually moving as the formula is being copied. But watch the orange one. Enter, enter. It's moving also. We do not want that to move. If, from the point of view of the formula, we want the cell reference to always look relatively one cell to the left, that's a relative cell reference. But we don't want this to be a relative cell reference, so we're actually going to have to go back up to the first cell and properly lock it as an absolute cell reference. So we're going to highlight the range, and I'm going to use the delete key, and we're going to create the formula again. Equals VL tab, left arrow to get my lookup value, comma, the table. And after we highlight our lookup table, we need to convert it from a relative range of cells to an absolute range of cells. And the way we do that on a PC is with the F4 key. If you're on a Mac, you use Command T. Look what happened. Those dollar signs in front of the column references and the row references mean that as we copy that, it will be locked. Now we have our absolute cell reference for our lookup table. Now we finish the formula, comma 3, because we're trying to get bat name, comma 0, close parentheses, Control Enter. And we're going to do one better this time. Instead of clicking with our angry rabbit and dragging, we're going to double click, and it automatically copies it down. It knows to stop here because there's no more records. Now, anytime we copy a formula down a column, you have to go to the last cell and hit F2. We're verifying that the cell references are pointing in the correct location. And that is beautiful. Relative cell reference, absolute cell reference. Exactly what we wanted. Now we have our data set, and we can create whatever report we want using times and the full bat name. Now we want to go on to our next example, example 6. And we want to see how to create a dynamic lookup table. And what that means is right now we have a lookup table. We have data validation dropdown all the way down to Carlota. And our lookup table array is looking at the correct lookup table. But what if we added new records or deleted some of these? Would our formula and data validation update? Not as it sits now. The way we can create a dynamic, that means we can expand or retract the rows in our lookup table, is by using the Excel table feature. Now, in order to convert this to an Excel table, you have to make sure that you have a proper data set. The column header names or field names have to be in the first row. And then the records, or in our case, product, supplier, and price, has to be in each row. And you have to have empty cells all the way around your proper data set. If those conditions are met, it's easy to convert it to an Excel table. You select a single cell, go up to Insert, Table Group, and there it is, the Table button. Or we can simply use the keyboard, Control-T. Now make sure that this is checked. We have headers. Click OK. Now it adds some formatting, and very conveniently, if you want, it adds sort and filter buttons. We don't really care about any of that. We just want the behind-the-scenes dynamic, expandable, contractible ranges. Now before we can use this in our formula, we have to make sure and go up to the Context-Sensitive Table Tools ribbon tab. Notice if I click on the side, it goes away. Click in the table, Table Tools, and you got to go over to Properties and name this table. We're going to call it something like Product Lookup. And when I hit Enter, we have registered that name for this table. And we have data validation that was pointing towards the first column. If I click the dropdown, oh, it says Carlota. But watch this. We're going to add a new record. Now, you can simply click in the cell directly below the last record, and we're going to type a new product, Sunshine. Now, as soon as I hit Tab, watch what happens to the corner of this table. Tab. It totally expands. Already, before we even complete the record, when I look at the data validation list, it's already acknowledging an expandable range. Now, I'm going to complete this. That's Channel Craft tab, and the price is $19.95. Now, if I hit Tab right here, it would add a new record, and I don't want that. So I'm simply going to hit Enter. Now, let's create our lookup formula using that table name equals VL tab, left arrow to get our product name, comma, and the table array. I'm going to show you 3 ways to put the table name in. The easy way is simply to click and drag, and because it's an Excel table, it automatically puts it in. Another way, if you have a big table, is watch this, your cursor. That is a diagonally pointing black arrow. For an Excel table, when you click, it tells the formula to automatically put the table name in. Still another way, if the table is far away, you can simply type. And I'm going to down arrow. And in my drop down for functions, of course, table names will appear also. Tab. Now we can finish our formula, comma 3, comma 0, close parentheses, and enter. Now let's see if this works. I'm going to come and click the drop down for sunshine. And just like that, it got 1995. If I click in the last cell and hit Tab, the next product is Sunspot. From Gel Boomerang's tab, 13.95, and enter. Now, if I come down here, sure enough, Sunspot. And that is just plain Excel magic. We're using data validation drop-down list, VLOOKUP, and the Excel table feature to make our life easy for looking up prices for a particular product in a dynamic way. Now, there's actually one other amazing use for the Excel table feature, and that is if this table was actually on a different sheet, you would simply convert it to an Excel table. And then, of course, as we did, we just type out our name. All right, let's go look at our next example on sheet 7. Now, in this example, we have a dynamic data source. That means we do not even have the lookup table in this file. The lookup table is in another Excel workbook. Now, before we import it, let's go look at that file. I'm on the desktop, and I have this file, source data. This is one of the files below the video that you can download. We're going to double click it and open it. And there's our lookup table. It's an official Excel table. If I look at table tools, the name is product price table. Now we'll close this file. Now we're back in our start file. I'm going to select A6, and our goal is to import that Excel lookup table into this workbook. Now in Office 365 or Excel 2016, it is amazingly easy. We go to Get Data, Get and Transform Group. This is also known as Power Query. And Get Data. We can import from virtually any data source, Excel workbook, text files. We could get something from a database. But we have our data in an Excel workbook. And now we click From Workbook. We have to navigate to the location and then double click. In the Navigator dialog box, it will show you all the different objects from your source. For us, we have a single table, product price table. And now I click not load. I'm going to click the drop down and say load to. Import data. We want to import it as a table on the existing sheet. A6 is already selected. I click OK. And that is absolutely beautiful. It did 2 things. First, we're connected to that external source. So when the external data changes, we simply refresh, and everything updates. And it came in as an Excel table. So everything's dynamic. Now let's do 2 things. Data. Over to data validation. We want a list. Source. Here we learned how to use that for the whole table, but you can use the downward black arrow to get just the column. There's the range. In data validation, it doesn't use the table name and column name like we would use in formulas. But it's still dynamic. Click OK. Now we have our drop down. Now let's do our formula. Equals VL tab, left arrow, comma. Highlight the whole table. There's our table name, comma. Column is 3 because we're trying to get price, comma. And we're still doing exact match, so 0. Close parentheses. Now we will get an error because I forgot to choose the product. Later in the video, we'll see how to create a formula to deal with that error. But I simply come over and select Bellin, and there's the price. Now I'm going to go to the desktop and open that file and add a new record. And this is not something necessarily that we would do, but whoever's in charge of this workbook, they would add a new record. There I have added a new record. I'm going to save it, close. Now let's check our drop down. Uh-oh, what happened? Oh, this definitely got imported, so we have to come over and right click. And because it's connected to a data source, that refresh button is there. I can click refresh. And that is amazing. It totally got it from a different Excel workbook. And our drop down is totally working. Now, when we imported this using data, get data, we were actually using Power Query. And when we use Power Query, it opens up the queries and connections. There's our query that's going and getting the external data. Now, the thing is, if the file that we connected to changes location, you need to come here and edit the file path. It's easy to do. You double click, and this opens up the Power Query editor. Now, all of this was done automatically for us, but over here in Applied Steps, Step 1, Source. You want to click the gear icon. And sure enough, there it is, the file path. So if you need to edit this, that's where you do it. I'm going to click OK and click Close. Now we want to go to example 8. But before we go to example 8, I want to go remind ourselves what we did in example 3 when we did straight commission rate. We did VLOOKUP to look up 90,000 and return 7.5. For straight commissions, that means 7.5% is multiplied by the 90,000 to get your commissions. Now, both for taxes and commissions, sometimes that's the way it is. There's a straight commission rate, but oftentimes there's a variable commission rate. So for example 8, we want to talk about a variable commission rate. And what we learn here applies exactly the same to many tax situations when you have a variable tax rate. Now, what this means is for a commission rate, a contract reads, the employee has sales from 0 to 50,000. Well, on that first 50,000, they get 3.5%. Anything above 50,000 up to 125, just that incremental amount of 75,000, that earns 4%. So for each different tier, there's a different commission rate. Now, luckily, we have a lookup table in most situations, especially for tax, which does the heavy lifting. Our first column has the lower limit, upper limit. This is the commission rate. So for this category right here, that 7.5% gets applied just for amounts above 175 up to 225. Luckily, this row in the lookup table has what we need to make our calculation. The total amount of sales from previous categories, and this is the real heavy lifting. It already calculated all of the commissions from the earlier brackets. Now, what that means is we're actually going to have to do 3 different VLOOKUPs before we can calculate the total commissions, which in this example is total gross pay. All right, so the first thing we have to look up is the total commissions through previous categories. Now, I can do this in my head, right? 214,000, race through, find the first one bigger, jump back. So it looks like all of the commissions that this person earned from earlier categories is 7,625. All right, so we're going to do VLOOKUP equals VL tab, left arrow to get my lookup value, comma, the table array. First column is what we're trying to match. I'm going to put all these in. F4 to lock it because we're copying this down, comma. Commissions through previous categories is in the 5th column, so I put a 5, comma. And we do not want approximate match. So remember, don't put the comma in. Just leave it out. You want to make sure that range lookup isn't bold. Now we close parentheses, Control Enter. That's the correct amount. Double click and send that down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. The cell references are working. Now, I went ahead and already did the next 2 VLOOKUPs. But the point is that sometimes one VLOOKUP is not going to be enough. In our case, we had to do 3. Now we can do gross pay. OK, ready? Equals. This is the commission paid through the previous categories, plus. And we're only allowed to take the excess, since that's the category, the excess above 175 all the way up to that amount. So in parentheses, we have to take the total amount of sales minus, and there's the amount of sales through the previous categories. That amount gives us, if I were to highlight this and hit the F9 key, that's just the amount that gets taxed times the 0.075. Control Z, close parentheses, times, and now we get our commission rate. Control Enter, and I'm going to copy it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2, all relative cell references. Now, sometimes you want to build it in little pieces like this and do your gross pay or total commissions. But sometimes in a payroll table, you want to take each one of these VLOOKUPs. Remember, that cell is looking to a VLOOKUP. That one's looking to a VLOOKUP, and so is that one. So really, sometimes your end goal looks like this. A bunch of VLOOKUPs. Now, that's beyond the scope of this video. But just remember, when you get into a variable tax or commission rate, you're going to probably have to do multiple VLOOKUPs. Now, our next example on sheet 9 is a human resource example. And we're going to get to see for the first time a new lookup function called the match function, which will help us do a two-way lookup. Now, here's our goal. We have an employee name here, and we want to be able to select whichever employee, and we need to extract the correct information for zip, state, and so on. Now, what this means is when I'm in this cell right here, we have to look up Chuck's Hal and get the correct city. So that would be Tacoma. That means this is column 3. But for zip code, we need column 5. Each one of these is going to need a different column index number. Now, instead of creating each one manually, there's a much better way to do it. Now, think about this. If you were looking up zip code and counting on your fingers in this range right here, well, it's in the 5th position. State is in the 4th position. Well, that's where the match function comes in. That's exactly what the match function does. It looks up an item and finds the relative position of the item in a list. So we can, before we do VLOOKUP, we're going to use a new lookup function called match. And look at that. It even has the same name for the first argument, lookup value. And our lookup value will be the column header names as we copy the formula down. So that's our lookup value, comma, lookup array. Notice it's not asking for a table. You can only put a one-way array here. It either has to be horizontal or vertical. No tables. Well, that's perfect for us because we have these field names at the top. Now, as I copy this down, I need to lock it, so I'm going to hit the F4 key. Now, comma. The third argument is almost exactly like VLOOKUP's fourth argument. Now, the match function doesn't use the same words as VLOOKUP, but less than means approximate match, and exact match means exact match. Now, this last option is for when something is sorted biggest to smallest, but it's rarely used when doing lookup. So when you're using match, the first two arguments are the same two arguments in VLOOKUP, approximate match and exact match. So we're putting a 0 because we're doing exact match, close parentheses. Remember, match is a lookup function, but when I Control Enter, it totally looked up zip code and counted on its finger and got 5. For VLOOKUP, that's perfect because that's the 5th column in our table. When I double click and send this down, sure enough, it got all of the correct column index numbers. Now we can use that inside of VLOOKUP instead of manually putting column index number. Now I want to check the last cell with F2 just to verify that the cell references are correct. Now let's build VLOOKUP with match in the column index argument, F2. Now right after the equal sign, I'm going to type VL tab. Now this is polite. VLOOKUP's screen tip with the arguments are listed. If I click inside of match, wow, that's really cool. Now if we have to put multiple functions in the same formula, we can easily get help by clicking inside and seeing which argument we're working on. Very carefully click after that, open parentheses, and there's lookup value. Now for VLOOKUP, we need to look up the employee name. So I'm going to click on that cell, and we're copying it down, and we need it locked. So I hit the F4 key, comma, table array. I'm going to highlight the table. This is the lookup table for employees. And I need to hit the F4 key to lock it, comma. And there it is, column index number. We are using the match function to make our life easy so we don't have to manually create each individual formula. Now, come to the end, comma, and we're definitely doing exact match because we're trying to find exactly that employee name. Oh, there it is, approximate match, exact match. I'm putting a 0 just like in the match function. Close parentheses. Now look at this. There it is. Range lookup, I put 0 for approximate match. In VLOOKUP, there we are inside of match. It's also doing exact match for its match type argument. Now Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2 to verify that all of the cell references are working. That's quite amazing. We're using VLOOKUP and match together to do a two-way lookup. Now it gets even better. City. I did not want city. I actually wanted address. And watch what happens when I hit Enter. It totally works. We did not hard code a number here. Since match is always looking that up, it's totally dynamic. And Enter. Now we did this vertically. You could do the same thing horizontally. I'm looking up Chuck's Hal, comma, in this table right here. F4 to lock it, comma. And right in column index, I'm just going to type out match. Now here's where the screen tips really come in handy, because right now I'm in VLOOKUP. But as soon as I type MA tab, the new screen tip pops up. Lookup value will be the column header name, comma. Lookup array, there it is. F4 to lock it, comma. 0 because I'm doing exact match. And when I close parentheses, the screen tips are polite. Now I see that match is sitting in column index. Very carefully at the end, I type a comma. And then 0 for exact match. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and copy it to the side. Oh, I forgot something. Well, let's go to the last cell and check what we did wrong. F2. I'm trying to verify if I got the cell references right. And I sure enough did not. That was supposed to be locked. Escape. Come back to the first cell, F2. Click inside of lookup value. I'm going to select it. And now I'm going to hit the F4 key. Control Enter. Copy it to the side. Click in the last cell and hit F2. Now the cell references are working. That is some magic. Match to look up the column index number, and VLOOKUP to look up the employee information. And Enter. All right, let's go on to our next exciting example on Sheet 10. Now, Sheet 10, we're going to learn how to do fuzzy lookup. That's when you have an incomplete lookup value. For example, right here, I want to be able to look up just Coca-Cola, but find Coca-Cola Incorporated, Georgia. Now, we can do that. We'll start with a straight VLOOKUP equals VL tab, left arrow to get my lookup value, comma. Here's the table. We're trying to find the company name and return the manager in the second column. F4 to lock it, comma, second column, comma, 0 for exact match, close parentheses. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Well, of course, it's not finding Coca-Cola because F2, VLOOKUP is looking for exactly those characters. And it cannot find exactly those characters. Well, there's something called a wildcard. If I put a wildcard before and after that cell reference, that means to any formula, take Coca-Cola with any number of characters before or after. And the wildcard is the asterisk. Now, you cannot just type an asterisk. You can already see the formula went dark. In order to get the wildcard asterisk to work, you have to put it in double quotes. Double quotes are the way that we're allowed to put text into a formula. And then you have to join that with cell D11. And you do that by using the join symbol, ampersand shift 7. What that means right now is that the lookup value would find Coca-Cola with 0 or more characters before. That means it could find exactly Coca-Cola or Coca-Cola with 1, 2, 3, any number of characters before. But we want it on both sides. So we say ampersand double quote, asterisk, and double quote. And that's how you do fuzzy lookup. There's the base, anything before or after, or even exactly the base. Now, I edited this formula in the middle of a column, so I'm going to have to Control Enter, double click and send it down. Then I'm going to drag it up. Now, let's talk about the successes here. It definitely found Tyrone Smith. Cable Wireless was easy to match with this full company name. Same with Chin Pham. Coca-Cola was matched with Coca-Cola Incorporated, Georgia. Well, these two are not anywhere in the list, so we're automatically going to get an NA no matter what. The problem with fuzzy lookup comes with DON and DON. Well, those are both in McDonald's and Donna's. There is no way that I know of to get around this. F2, that's why when you do fuzzy lookup, you're never going to 100% get what you want. And the reason we're never going to be 100% accurate is because right there, it really is DON with anything before or after. So both of these are a match. Further, when you're doing exact match lookup for any one of the Excel lookup functions, when there are duplicates like there are here, it can only see the first one. So that's why there are some drawbacks. Nevertheless, sometimes people like it because they want to try and get a full match from a partial text item. Now, I want to show you a very important VLOOKUP trick on our next sheet, sheet 11. Now, we have the same exact formula here, but the cool trick we're going to learn here will work on any lookup formula. So there's a lookup formula, and sometimes it's returning NA. So if we want to substitute something in for the NA, this is the function, IFNA. Now, this function came in Excel 2013. So any version after that has IFNA. The value, that's the lookup function. And we come to the end and we type a comma. It says value IFNA. That just means what would you like to substitute in. Now, I want to put the text no match. And because text is going into a formula, you have to use double quotes. No match, end double quotes, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. So there we get no match, no match. Now again, that IFNA is great for any lookup formula. IFNA is not going to help us with the inaccuracy of fuzzy lookup though. All right, so IFNA. Let's go to our next sheet, 12, and we want to see yet another partial text lookup. Here's a column with transaction ID. And the transaction ID is made up of product ID, supplier abbreviation, and a date. Well, if we want to look up and return product name, we only want the first 4 characters. Well, luckily, there's some great text functions in Excel, left, right, and mid. You can get text from the left, from the right, or in the middle. So for us, the text we want is always 4 characters from the left, equals left. The text, that's a relative cell reference, comma, number of characters. We always want 4, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. And there we have our lookup value. But there's one problem. That number and this number right there look different. And the reason why is in Excel, text is always aligned to the left. Numbers are always aligned to the right. And any one of the left, right, or mid functions, or any text function, always delivers text. Now, if we put this into VLOOKUP, it just wouldn't work. Now, we could put it into VLOOKUP and get the error, but let me just prove it to you. Is 1498, and I'm going to use an equal sign as a comparative operator. hey, that 1498, are you equal to this 1498? When I hit enter, of course it says false, because in Excel, text numbers are not equivalent to actual numbers. Well, luckily, there's a great trick to convert text numbers back to numbers. I'm going to hit F2. You can do any math operation on this right here as long as it doesn't change the value. If you multiply by 1, Control Enter, well, there, it converted it to an actual number. Any math operation, you could divide by 1. F2, you could add 0. You could even do a double negative in the front. I'm going to leave it as add 0. It's a math operation. It doesn't change the value. So when I Control Enter, now I have a number that I can match against that number. And we can sure enough see our logical formula over here says we're good to go. Now I'm going to double click and send this down. Come to the top cell, F2. And now we're going to use VL tab. The lookup value is exactly what we want. Comma. Table array. Come over here. And we're copying this, so we need to hit the F4 key. Comma. Second column has product name. 2, comma, 0 for exact match. Close parentheses. And there is extracting partial text and converting it to a proper number in lookup value inside of VLOOKUP. Control Enter. That is so cool. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Verifying that the cell references are correct. I'm going to hit Enter. Now let's go over to example 13. Now in this example, we have a lookup table, and this is the column we're trying to retrieve items from. But sometimes the column in the lookup table will have empty cells. So I want to see what happens when we do a VLOOKUP to this item. What happens when VLOOKUP returns an empty cell? Equals VL tab, left arrow to get lookup value, comma. Company is the first column. We're trying to retrieve manager in the second column, comma 2, comma 0, close parentheses. Now when I hit enter, of course, Bath College will work because Surad Coolinator is there. But when I select Cable Wireless, wow, VLOOKUP returns a 0. Well, in fact, any formula that points to an empty cell returns a 0. Now, if our goal is to have the formula show nothing rather than the 0 anytime a manager name is missing, then we're going to use a simple trick. We're going to join it using the ampersand, Shift 7, and we're going to use a strange text item. We're going to use double quote, double quote. And this is the third time we've used double quotes. Anytime you use double quotes like this, you're putting text into the formula. Now, because there's nothing between the two double quotes, this is called a zero-length text string. And in Excel, that's how we can get our formula to show nothing. By the way, if you wanted some alternative text, then you'd have to use a different formula with the if function. But now when I hit enter, that achieved our goal. If I select Donna's, sure enough, Chantel. But PCC's, better show nothing. So VLOOKUP and join a zero-length text string. Now we want to go to our 14th example, and this might be the coolest one so far. Now here's the situation. We actually do need to look up the price of a pipe. We're selling pipes. For this transaction, we sold 324. That's a 2-inch pipe, and we need to look up the price. Down here, we have to look up the price of a 10-inch pipe. The problem is, the lookup formula right here needs to find the UPVC table, which is right there. When I get down to this transaction, it's a different lookup table. I need my formula to go to PPVC, this second table. So the lookup problem we have to solve here is how do we get our formula as we copy it down to look to the correct first, second, or third table? Well, there's an easy way to do it because we have a type column. For each row, we have an indicator. That is UPVC. That's text. It tells us to go to this table. When we get down to this record right here, PPVC will tell us to go to this table. But that means we need to name each one of these tables. Naming a range is easy in Excel. I'm going to highlight. And remember, this is a lookup table, so we don't include the column headers. Go up to the Formulas Ribbon tab, and there it is, Defined Names Group. We click Name Manager. Now remember, my icons might look different than yours, but click Name Manager. And here's our dialog box. We can click New, and most importantly, we can come back and edit and delete later. I'm going to click New. I want to call this range right here the exact same thing that's listed in the type column, UPVC. Now notice down here it shows the range. If you ever needed to edit, you come back here and edit. I'm going to click OK. Now I showed you the Name Manager because it's important to know how to edit and delete names using the Name Manager. But when we're creating new names, there's an easier way. I'm going to click Close. We'll highlight the second table, and right up in the formula bar all the way to the left, hover your cursor, and sure enough, that's the name box. So I click, and now I'm going to type PPVC and enter. Uh-oh, I definitely want it capital, even though Excel would consider that equivalent to that right there. So I actually did make a mistake. I'll have to go edit it. But now I'm going to use the name box. Highlight the third lookup table. Come up here, CPVC, and enter. Now, unfortunately, I made a mistake, so I'm going to go to Formulas, Name Manager. Click on that and edit. And I'm going to change it to capital. Again, that wouldn't have mattered because Excel considers the letter C whether capital or lowercase equivalent. Click OK. Now we have our names. Click Close. And here's our simple formula, equals VL tab. I'm going to left arrow to get the inches. That's what we're looking up in the first column of whichever table it is, comma. And I'm going to use my arrow key to arrow over. That represents these tables. Now, actually, that's text. These are defined names over here. But because it's in table array, it should work, comma. We are always looking up from the second column. So for column index, I put 2. And guess what? We're definitely using approximate match lookup. Every single time, we're searching through, finding the first bigger one, and jumping back. So we completely leave out range lookup because the default is approximate match. Close parentheses, Control, Enter, NA. Yes, there's a problem, F2. Right here, if I highlight that and hit the F9 key, which is the evaluation key, Excel properly thinks that it's text because it is text. It's not the defined name. Control Z. You are not going to believe this. There's a function built exactly to solve our problem. It's called INDIRECT. And all it does is it takes text that represents a reference or a defined name or a range of cells and converts it to that reference. So when I wrap indirect around that text item, now in table array, if I hit the F9 key, that is amazing. The indirect took that text item, which represented this table right here, and converted it to that defined name, the correct lookup table. And you can see 1, 1595, sure enough. 2, 2295, it got the table right. Control Z, Control Enter. Uh-oh, F2. Look at that. I accidentally have a minus there. So I backspace, Control Enter, double click and send it down. And that is amazing. Now let's manually check. 2, sure enough, in the first table. Down here, that's 10 for PPVC. Sure enough, 95.95. Now let's verify again. F2, click inside VLOOKUP. Click on Table Array. F9, we're verifying. And sure enough, 112.95, there it is. The last one, 10.95.95, it got the correct table. Control Z. Now that is such a cool trick. Indirect function and define names to look up to multiple tables. Now we could complete this by multiplying number of pipes times price and getting our total sales. But we'll leave that for another day. Look up to multiple tables. All right, let's look at our last example on sheet 15. Two lookup values. Wow, look at this. If I'm going to look this up right here, there's a code, but that code represents both left and right-handed. So right here, we actually have two entries into the first column of our lookup table. So when I'm right here, I need to look up that code with an L on the end. But when I'm right here, I need to look up that code with an R on the end. No problem. We can do that. Equals VL tab lookup value. Well, guess what? I need that, but I also need to join it to the L. And how do we do that? The join symbol, ampersand, Shift 7. Now, when I click on this one, I'm going to have to lock it with the F4 key. And there it is. Right in lookup value, I could hit the F9 key and verify. It is now a single item. Control Z. Now I could finish the formula, comma. Here's the table. Lock it with the F4, comma 2, comma 0, close parentheses, Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. There we have our correct cell references. Now watch this. I'm going to cheat. F2. Copy this in edit mode. Control C, escape. F2, Control V. And here's a great trick. If you point to the edge of a cell reference, that's the selection cursor. But that is called the move cursor. I'm going to click and drag. That is so cool. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Now, there is one other way to do this. I'm going to delete everything but the top cell here. And it involves something different than relative and absolute. We're going to talk about a mixed cell reference. Now, what do I want D5 to do? Well, I want it to move as I copy down. But when I copy the VLOOKUP to the side, oops, it needs to be locked on the D column. So the way you do that is you hit the F4 key one time, then two times. That puts the $ just in front of the row reference. A third time locks just the column. That means as I copy this down, the 5 will move to 6, 7, and so on. But when we copy it to the side, that D is locked. We can do the same thing here. I'm going to double click. And now I'm going to hit the F4 key once, just a single time. Now, the 4 is locked. So as I copy the formula down, the 4 doesn't move to 5, 6, 7, and so on. It's locked on that L. But look at that. I did not put a $ in front of the E. So when I copy the formula from the E column over to the F column, the E is allowed to move to F because there's no $. Now, the cool thing about this is this formula will work throughout the entire table. Control Enter. Copy it to the side. Double click and send it down. Go to the diagonally furthest cell away and hit F2. That is some magic. It's looking at the correct R, code, and the table. Wow, what an amazing way to end this video. Mixed cell references, two lookup values. Wow, that was an amazing 15 examples. And over here on the topic sheet, I put a picture of each one of the formulas as a quick reference guide for you. So you don't forget, use 0 for false, leave it out for approximate match, all the way down to, don't forget, you can join two values for your lookup value. Hopefully the mysteries of the VLOOKUP function have been revealed. Hey, if you like this video, be sure to click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe, because there's always lots more videos to come from Excel is Fun. And don't forget, when you click that subscribe, click that bell icon. All right, we'll see you next video.